I'm James Robinson. You're listening to Multiverses. There is no consensus in science or philosophy about what minds are. Yet there's plenty of agreement about who has them. We do, humans. However, humans may account for just a small proportion of the minds, of the consciousness that's out there. And not just in the universe as a whole, but even on our own planet, there may be many more minds than we assume. Our guest this week is Kristin Andrews, a professor of animal minds at the University of York in Canada. And as you might guess from her title, she is a philosopher of mind, and yet she is not uniquely focused on humans. And another, point of departure from the typical image, or the cliche, of a philosopher of mind, is that her work is in very close contact with science. We start our conversation by talking about comparative psychology, a subfield of biology that looks at animal behavior and tries to understand it in terms of mental processes. And Kristin argues that this field has been historically hampered by a kind of irrational reluctance to ascribe anything like intentions, desires, even learning, certainly minds and consciousness, to animals. And that would be well and good were it not for the case that it's just very hard to make sense of the richness and complexity of animal behavior without resorting to these kind of concepts. So this is not an ethical argument for believing in animal minds and taking them seriously. It's just saying it's good science to do so. It's the best explanation for what we see in the world. And what we end up is with Kristin arguing that we should switch the null hypothesis in biology. So the null hypothesis at the moment is, if you come across some new species, assume it doesn't have a mind. She's saying, well, no, every species that we've looked for the markers of minds in, where we've done detailed studies, and we'll talk about what the markers of minds that are commonly accepted by biologists are. But wherever we look for these indications, even in the humblest of species, even in C. elegans, a nematode worm, we find multiple of these markers. So Kristin's point is, instead of sort of focusing or thinking about where are the minds, like which species have them, this problem of distribution, as she puts it, we should instead switch to the problem of dimension. What kind of minds are there? What's the variety of consciousness that exists? And that way we might make more progress in terms of getting to a consensus and a stable theory of what minds are. So it's just, these are fascinating topics. But more than this is a great case study, if you like, of a philosopher whose work is completely continuous with science. Not only does Kristin, read and cite scientific papers, but she's lived in the jungle. She's bringing the best of philosophy and the best empirical data together. So I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Hi, Kristin Andrews. Welcome to Multiverses.
Thanks, James. It's great to be here.
So you're a philosopher of animal minds, and I think this is, you are perhaps one of the first, if not the first, philosopher of animal minds, at least of the modern era, perhaps. But there is quite a long history of people thinking about whether animals have minds, and from what I can tell from reading your work, there's been quite a lot of flip-flopping historically on this question. Could you give us a brief overview of the kind of history of this idea?
Yeah, sure. So if you look at, say, ancient Greek philosophy, you see that there's a lot of engagement with animals, the animals that the Greeks saw around them, especially insects. There was so much interest in ants and bees and the social insects that Aristotle and Plato wrote about. Because they were taking questions about philosophical questions to be answerable not just by looking at other humans, but by looking at other animals as well. Because their default hypothesis was that these animals also have minds. They're also doing things together in society. They're also showing their intelligence. They're also showing their feelings and emotions. Aristotle said that the other animals aren't rational. Rationality is unique to humans, but they certainly had consciousness. They certainly had feelings and emotions. They certainly have relationships. But it wasn't just the Greek philosophers. You see this across world philosophy. You see this in the Asian tradition as well. The Buddha famously talking about non-human animals and the avoidance of suffering in all living beings. You see this also in Ibn Sina in Arabic philosophy, addressing and just basically assuming that we're not the only conscious being. So it was really not a question about whether other animals have minds or consciousness for these philosophers. There was a lot of question about whether other animals are rational, whether they engage in logical thought, what kinds of minds they have, but not that they're the sorts of things who have minds. And I really think that we can trace it to Darwin or blame it all on, I'm sorry, I think that we can trace it all to Descartes and blame it on Descartes for raising this question that we have now about whether other animals have minds, which animal species have minds, with his famous denial of mind and consciousness in all other species. So we're kind of clawing out of this hole that was dug for us back a couple hundred years ago, and we've been making a lot of progress, but things have varied a little bit because there was a lot of work done among psychologists in the late 19th century, early 20th century. People like Margaret Floy Washburn, who was one of the first women psychologists, and she wrote a book called The Animal Mind. She presumed that all animals were minded, including very simple organisms like worms. We see this in the work of people like Pavlov, who famously studied dog learning. He said it would be absurd to deny consciousness to these animals. And we see it even in people like Thorndike and Morgan. These are figures who sometimes are associated with behaviorism, but certainly they assume that animals have minds. So again, what we saw is there was this kind of clawing out of the Cartesian trap, and then we get Skinner and Watson pulling us back down into the behaviorist hole and denying consciousness to animal minds. Today, 2024, we're maybe 50 years out of behaviorism when it comes to human cognition. But animal cognition research took a little bit longer to start recovering. And I think that most of the researchers I know who study animal cognition would say that the field itself kind of started in maybe the 1980s. We certainly don't see textbooks in animal cognition until the 1990s, and then starting around 2000, we see a number of different textbooks. I think it's really good to look at textbooks if you want to know what's going on in a science, right? You can see what the students are being taught. And interestingly, in these textbooks of animal cognition, there's no real discussion of how to study animal consciousness. In fact, what there is a kind of a warning to students to not study animal consciousness. That animal consciousness isn't scientific. So there's still work to be done because there's science to be done on this question, and animal cognition researchers are great folks to be doing that work. So that's a very brief history, I suppose, of kind of the ups and downs of views in the world about whether animals are conscious.
Yeah, I think it's a really great summary, and I guess the one argument we should maybe say that Descartes gave, just so people are aware of it if they're not familiar, is that animals don't have language. We're the only folks with language, or at least with. Well, that's a controversial statement now, but at least in Descartes' day, as far as he knew, we're certainly the only species with language, and it's clearly the case we're the only species with as complex a language as we have. And the other D that you mentioned, Darwin, obviously going in the other direction. But I wasn't aware until I read your works just how forcefully he kind of denied there being any kind of
I think, as you put it, any fundamental difference between the mental faculties of animals and humans. So, clearly he was acknowledging there's some difference in degree of what we do in terms of our mental faculties, and leaving the door open, obviously, for there being a difference in the cultural inheritance of animals and humans. But sort of at the biological level, I suppose, he was very clear in saying, yeah, no, we're actually pretty continuous. And many of these behaviors that we see, that we associate with minds in humans, we find in animals too.
That's right. That's right. It's really worth going back and reading The Descent of Man, because Darwin, in a couple of chapters of that book, which I love, argues that we see so many rich emotions in non-human animals, including moral emotions, including fellow feeling for the other species, right? Dogs feeling for humans, and also feeling for one's children and members of one's own species. It's a really beautiful writing. But the worry that people had about the descent of man argument that Darwin made about continuity in mentality across species is that the evidence was based on anecdote.
Right.
These were really just stories that he collected from people who had traveled the world. And then he said, hey, look, animals are doing these cool things, so they must have these kind of cognitive and affective capacities. But what the comparative cognition research is doing now is they're doing science to try to verify or undermine the sorts of anecdotes that Darwin collected. But actually what we're finding is that these anecdotes largely reflect animals' capabilities. When we look for things in non-human animals, we very often find them. It might take a very long time, but sometimes humans are smart enough to figure out what animals are thinking.
Yeah. And coming back to comparative psychology, as you say, this, in some ways, this field is still embracing behaviorism, while that has been rejected kind of fairly roundly in human psychology. But when it comes to comparative psychology, i.e. looking for the differences and similarities between human and other animals, it still seems to be flavored by that perspective. You give a really good kind of rundown, I think, based on the textbooks, of three kind of big themes or rules, I suppose, which are taught, drilled into people who are entering this field, that kind of embrace that I don't know, skepticism of animal minds, and I suppose trying to move away, trying to be as scientific as possible, but perhaps actually doing a disservice to the science. Could you give us a rundown of those rules?
Yeah, so Morgan's canon is probably the best known rule that comparative cognition researchers are taught and still follow. So C. Lloyd Morgan, who is one of the advocates of animal consciousness, actually introduced this rule that says we should prefer basically simpler explanations to more complex explanations for animal behavior. But as you might imagine, there's a lot of debate about what counts as simpler and complex. And this is a very difficult rule to actually implement. If you go back and look at the way Morgan put this rule, it was within a theory he had about cognition that's been rejected. So he was saying, well, these are the sorts of cognitive capacities that are more complicated and these are simpler. And so we should prefer these sorts of explanations. But these details are completely lost and disregarded because they don't seem to fit the science. And so the way this Morgan's canon is interpreted today is that we should prefer associative explanations over cognitive explanations. Now, what does that mean? That's a really good question. Putting it that way introduces a presumption that cognitive explanations can't be associative. But I think that we know that a lot of cognition involves associative processes, right? We do a lot of our work, our memory, our language learning, our all sorts of reasoning processes through associative processes, associative reasoning. And so this distinction doesn't seem to hold up at all. And so then some people will say, well, we should give explanations in terms of the associative processes and not talk about high level capacities like theory of mind or mental time travel or planning, but we should figure out what the lower level implementation of those things are and when we're giving the explanations. But then one of the problems is that we don't do that when we're doing human psychology. We do talk about theory of mind, episodic memory, planning, things like that. And so it would be doing the sciences of animal cognition differently from the sciences of human cognition. And then we're not in a position to make those kinds of comparisons and ask questions like the questions that Darwin was interested in about continuity across species. If we want to look at continuity across species and differences across species, we need to use the same measuring stick. We can't use different ones.
Yeah. You point out that kind of one of the consequences of Morgan's canon perhaps is just an operationalization of language, which doesn't seem that helpful, where a behavior that might term friendship in humans is called affiliation or affiliate connections, or something that we might talk about episodic like memory. And it's not really clear what benefit we get from adding these new terms. It seems like they're being done to sort of pay lip service to this and kind of ostensibly distance oneself from anthropomorphizing, perhaps. But it's not really clear that they're necessarily more basic or that they've provided a simpler explanation. In some ways, it's the reverse, because they depend on their understanding of those things probably depends on what we see in humans. It seems, Morgan's canon at one level strikes me as a kind of application of Occam's razor, and therefore kind of hard to argue with. But as a kind of the way that it's been applied, or the heuristic that it's driving is rather different, and might actually have, in some cases, the reverse effect of leading us to the simplest explanation. Like, we might end up with very convoluted ways of trying to understand an animal's behavior when we could just say something like, "Oh, it wants to do this," right? Or it or it's caring for its young, right? So, we've perhaps lost our way somewhat with Morgan's canon.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that when we are explaining what an animal's doing at the level of an agent, and we're interested in what they're doing in their community, in their environment, talking about them in terms of what they want to do or what they're thinking and what they're feeling makes a lot of sense for those kinds of explanations. But it doesn't mean that that's the full explanation. It doesn't mean that that's the final story. Right? For any phenomenon, we can give different levels of explanation. The same goes for humans, right? You can explain my behavior towards my family in folk psychology and say, yes, I love my partner and my daughter, and I enjoy playing with my daughter and my dog and things like this. But it doesn't mean that there's not also, say, a neuroscientific explanation of that behavior as well. There's not an explanation in terms of the biology. There's not an evolutionary explanation for what I'm doing. Explanations are answers to why questions. And we can have a lot of different why questions about the same phenomenon. So it's really important to remember in animal cognition research that if we're saying things like, oh yeah, the animal remembers what happened back there, remembers where they cached their food, we don't we haven't necessarily answered the question that's being asked. If we want to know something about the implementation level of that capacity, right? Where in the brain is this memory being stored? Are there memory traces? How are they stored? These are further questions, and they're questions that are appropriately asked in different subdisciplines of the sciences.
Yeah, and of course, none of these explanations need be exclusive of another explanation either. So we don't need, like, maybe there is a place for Morgan's canon within a particular subfield, but it shouldn't be interpreted as saying this is the only way of understanding animal behavior, I suppose.
Right. I mean, as you said, what we need in any of our scientific endeavors are rules about, having a bunch of different explanations and then deciding between those different explanations. And how we decide between those different explanations is going to depend on the science we're doing. So there's not really a catch-all. We're not really getting any new information from Morgan's canon saying prefer simpler explanations. I think would be what's more helpful for animal cognition researchers would be some training, maybe in philosophy of science and how abductive reasoning works, right? Inference to the best explanation.
Right.
When you've got a lot of different information about what animals are doing or any phenomenon, and then you have multiple hypotheses on the table, then you pick the hypothesis that fits your evidence the best for now. And then you
Yeah.
continue working with that. And then if something happens and that's no longer the best explanation, you throw it out or put it back on the table and pick up something else and work with that. I mean, that's just how science works. So there's nothing really special or unique about animal cognition research, I think, that requires that field of research to have its own special rule about how to do science.
Right. Yeah. Perhaps we can talk about the other two rules of the three we mentioned, which I think are more kind of specific to comparative psychology. I think I mentioned one of the words earlier, anthropomorphism. So perhaps that's a good one, or anti-anthropomorphism, I suppose, is the rule. So take us through how that gets adopted within comparative psychology.
Yeah, so comparative psychology really guides the students and researchers to not anthropomorphize their subjects. And what that means is treat them as if they were little humans, right? Attribute human characteristics to them. And you might ask, well, what counts as a human characteristic? We have lots of features. We have mass. We have organs like hearts. It's not advising us not to talk about the mass of animals or their hearts, but what it does is advises us not to talk about human unique characteristics when it comes to other animals. But the question that arises are, well, what characteristics are human unique, right? If we go into the science with already a presumption about which features are human unique, then we're not going to look for them in other species. And then we're just going to reinforce this bias that we started out with. So I reject this worry about anthropomorphism understood that way. Because we should be asking broad questions about other animals. We can be asking questions not just about whether they have theory of mind, but we can be asking questions about whether they have morality, whether they're rational agents, whether they make plans for the future. These are all viable research questions that this rule of anti-anthropomorphism just kind of shuts down. It just tells people, oh, don't do this kind of research. It's not scientific. But it's exactly what science is, asking questions about things we don't know about and not making presumptions ahead of time about the way the world is.
Yeah, right. I mean, I guess probably this rule was introduced in the spirit of a response to places where anthropomorphism is taken too far. And, I can buy that sometimes that does happen. Perhaps with, some of the anecdotes that Darwin was fond of collecting, certainly the ones which, are more striking and therefore more likely to get picked up as an anecdote and get passed around are the ones where we see a very human-like thing being done by an animal. Like a dog walking on its legs, like classic example, right? That's on its hind legs. Or lots of other species can do that, but it's very striking when it's a dog that does that, or a parrot, talking or appearing to, at least saying words. So I can understand the spirit in which it's done, but as you say, it completely closes off particular avenues of questioning. One thing I do wonder is just about this word anthropomorphism. Like, just the word itself puts us in such a privileged position, right? I mean, are there places where we can think of things that might previously have been sort of thought of as very human qualities, that actually maybe animals are better at, or more, where these qualities are perhaps more strongly instantiated in animals?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly true that if we look at other species, there are definitely cases where they're better than we are at lots of things. Let's say the perceptual capacity of echolocation.
Hmm.
So we can kind of echolocate, right? We can, if you close your eyes and you make noise in your space, you can kind of get a sense of your space. But you can't navigate your space the way bats can or dolphins can, right? Echolocation is much more developed in these other species. So dolphins and bats are better than us at
Mm-hmm.
echolocation. And we can say this about a lot of different perceptual capacities that other animals have. Ed Yong wrote a beautiful book called An Immense World, where he detailed all of these different sensory capacities that other animals have. It was really beautifully illustrated at this point. But then there are other kinds of capacities that used to be thought to be human unique. So tool use is a famous one, right? Humans as the rational animal turned into that Aristotelian view got turned into this idea that humans are the only tool users. Um, and when Jane Goodall found out that chimpanzees make and use tools, Louis Leakey famously said, well, now we have to redefine man, redefine tool, or accept that chimpanzees are human, something along those lines. So we're learning, yeah, chimpanzees aren't as good at tool use as we are. We can build, much more elaborated structures than the chimpanzees do. Our tools are more complex than the chimpanzee tools, but they're also using tools. So there are these cases where we see similarities in degree, where we're still better than the animals in one sense, but we also see similarities where the animals are better than we are.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I also wonder about things like empathy or social complexity more broadly, where um, actually animals may, they may have more of those qualities, or perhaps dimensions of those qualities that we don't even appreciate. And yeah, so this idea that we are kind of transporting or transferring, projecting, I suppose is the best word, human qualities onto other animals, in some cases could be kind of backwards, right? Maybe those qualities are better understood in animals, or more strongly present than in humans.
Yeah, this is a good question. I have a couple of thoughts about this. One is that when we look at, say, eusocial insects, where they have this very different organizational structure, we see individuals sacrificing themselves for the group, right? So you might say that this is like a maybe a morally more developed society than our society or something. Like one might make moral judgments about different kinds of social structures. We also see this willingness to sacrifice oneself in cetaceans, right? When dolphins get stranded, and when dolphin gets stranded on a beach and all the other dolphins won't leave them, what's going on there? Some people speculate that this is because they have a group mind. Others speculate that the empathy that they have toward the stranded individual is so strong they can't leave them. And so we could make value judgments about these sorts of things as well. But the other example that came to mind when you said this is something I've been thinking about a lot, and that is multiculturalism in non-human animals. So we have today there's a lot of discussion about cultural appropriation
Mm.
and whether that is acceptable. There's a lot of objections when, say, Western cultures adopt elements of indigenous cultures or Asian cultures. Um, but we see in non-human animals a lot of cultural appropriation, a lot of learning from other animal cultures and adopting those new behaviors as they're exposed to them. And this is not just across the same species of animal. Say when an orangutan who uh, let's say a chimpanzee that uses a rock to crack nuts moves into a community
Mm.
where they use wood hammers to crack nuts, and they might show them, hey, you can use rocks to crack nuts as well. Like, this is the sort of thing that can happen in chimpanzee societies. But we can also see this sort of learning across species where an individual, for example, I'm trying to think of a really good example. I I love the examples of nest
Mhm.
making, because there's some theory that um, that animals have learned about building nests from looking at other animals building nests, and that they
Mm.
pick up on these techniques across species, and also medicinal use. That there's some evidence that animals who see other animals eating a plant in a certain time will explore that plant and learn about its medicinal qualities. Like, there's not this worry about where the information flows and that the information has to stay within a certain kind of culture. There seems to be just this kind of more generosity in allowing others to acquire the same knowledge that is kept in a single community. So I like I like these kinds of examples of how humans might be able to learn from other animals when we look at how willing animals are to share information across species and across communities, and not protect it in the way we sometimes do.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I'm sort of humans obviously have tried to appropriate some animal thing. Like I'm thinking of Da Vinci watching birds flying and try figuring out, oh, how could I do that, right? So it's really wonderful to. I wasn't aware of that going the between species the other way. I mean, I think the whole field of animal culture, it, it seems so only so recent that it's being studied. And I'm aware of the kind of gorilla tool use case and how one side of a river they're using the rocks and the other they're using something else to crack these nuts. And it's just something we weren't aware of probably 100 years ago. And another of those things that's been knocked down is, oh, this is uniquely human.
Yeah, absolutely. We're learning so much every day about grade 8 behavior. And I think it's kind of critical that we continue doing this work, funding this work, training students, spending our money to support this research, especially because these are critically endangered communities. And yeah, we can preserve the DNA of great apes in zoos, but we cannot preserve their culture in zoos. Their culture will be gone. We will not know what kind of what kind of knowledge they've stored and developed over generations if we just take them and put them in zoos. So it's really essential to do this work, and it is super exciting because, yeah, new findings all the time, right? We just saw these new reports of orangutan medicinal use, that orangutans use different kinds of leaves as anti-insecticides, and we've continued to see this kind of evidence of great apes and other animals using plants as medicines in many different cases. Yeah.
And how I have to ask about this because I'm completely fascinated by it. It's unusual for philosophers to actually get out into the field, out of their armchairs, as it were. Dennett famously did it with vervet monkeys, looking at their calls. But you've also been in the jungle. Yeah, danger of opening a big tangent here, but I'd love to hear just a little bit about that experience and, whether you think more people should be doing that as philosophers, not just biologists and primatologists.
Yeah, absolutely. All of my students have to have some time doing science in order to be a philosopher of animal minds. I think that it's absolutely essential. And it's great to get out into the field as well. So my field work has been with orangutans. When I moved to York University, I had experience working in a dolphin lab in Hawaii that was run by Lou Herman. Lou was working on things like dolphin communication using a gestural language, analogical reasoning, memory, things like that. Really cool work. But I'd never been in the field. And I met my colleague, Ann Russin. She gave a talk at York. She was in the psychology department and worked with orangutans in Borneo. And after her talk, I went up and introduced myself, said I'm a new colleague in philosophy. I work on animal cognition and worked with dolphins, and said how great dolphins were. And she was like, dolphins aren't great at all. You should meet orangutans. You should come to Borneo. And I said, okay. And that summer, I went to Borneo for the first time and spent about a month with orangutans in a forest school. A forest school is a weird little piece of forest where rehabilitant orangutan babies are being trained to be wild orangutans. So it was at a rehab, and there are a lot of issues in Southeast Asia with the orangutan populations. As I said, these are endangered animals, and a lot of the reason they're endangered is because there's palm plantations that are being built and their moms get shot and there are babies without moms, or there's pet trade and moms get shot and babies get taken away to be sold into as a pet. So there are a lot of baby orangutans, and I met 12 of them out of the kind of hundreds that were being kept in the facilities locally. And these 12 were lucky because they were getting the opportunity to learn how to be orangutans. So I didn't just get to go in and work with orangutans. I got to go in and work with orangutans who are learning from humans how to be orangutans, which was
Right.
really bizarre. And I saw so much in the first few days I was out there. I saw a lot of things that I had read scientific articles saying that great apes don't do. I saw deception. I saw social referencing, like looking at the human in order to figure out how I should respond to this situation. I saw play and jokes and relationships and curiosity. I mean, it was just obvious. You spend some time with these animals, and you see so richly their minds in the same kind of folk psychological way we would richly see the minds of like, say, human children when we go and hang out and watch them on a playground. And so after I got back from Borneo the first time, I really did like going to playgrounds in Toronto and watching the kids. It was very similar. Experience, just looking at them and trying to figure out what's going on in their heads. But it was a great opportunity. And then I went back a couple of times and I followed Anne to Kutai National Park, where she set up a wild orangutan site. And we went there. I brought my 7-year-old daughter there too, and we were tracking wild orangutans through the forest. I'm actually kind of running that site right now, as my colleague
Wow.
Ann Wilson is retired. This has been 20 years now of this time with orangutans, and setting it up so that Dr. Wendy Erb can take it over, which is going to be very exciting.
You're
But
dangerously close to being a scientist.
getting out in the field is great. I highly recommend it to anyone who has the opportunity to go and watch animals. And the field can be your backyard or your local park. Going out and just watch the animals do something for a while, whether it's ants or squirrels or foxes. It's absolutely fascinating.
Brilliant. Yeah. And I think, particularly interesting as well that you can also see the interaction of scientists with animals. So, because I see that come across in your work that, it's not just the animal mind, but what is it? It's what people say about the animal mind. And I imagine, in the field, like, one is just forced to leave any assumptions about animals not having minds at the door, as it were, and to make any headway, right? Particularly in, gosh, yeah, such a difficult situation as like an animal rehab.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, fascinating. A couple of last things on anthropomorphism. I just want to get out or get two concepts into people's heads. One is kind of critical anthropomorphism, which I touched upon briefly with Gordon Burkhardt previously, and another is anthropectomy, I think, a term which you introduced. Perhaps you could give your kind of take on both of these concepts.
Yeah, so critical anthropomorphism is this idea that really relates to the idea that I call anti-anthropocentrism in my book, How
Mm-hmm.
to Study Animal Minds. The ideas are the same. So this is something that I think is important for animal cognition researchers to do, and that is recognize where there are differences between humans and the animals that they're studying. So don't be anthropocentric. Don't think that everyone is going to be like you, but recognize how different sensory systems are going to affect their behavior. Recognize how different desires and interests are going to affect others' behavior. Recognize how different embodiments will affect behavior. So it's this idea that goes back to von Uxküll when he talked about the tick, that the tick, like every other animal, has their own world, their umwelt, their sensory world that matters to them. We cannot process every bit of information that's in our environment. There's way too much. Some of it we cannot see without instruments. I can't see the molecules on my desk because I don't have the right sensory equipment to do that. I can't see ultraviolet light because I don't have the right sensory equipment to do that. I can't sense the heat of other animals in my environment, et cetera, et cetera. But others can. And so for the tick, their world is a world of heat and a few other things, but it doesn't have the same sort of qualities as the environment does for a human. And it's the same goes for a dog, right? Take your dog for a walk. Your dog is going to notice so many things that you don't notice. The umwelt of the dog is a lot of smells that we don't register. And so I spent a lot of time wondering what my dog's smelling and thinking, wow, wouldn't it be cool to be able to see what happened an hour ago, the way my dog can see what happened an hour ago by smelling the urine of the dog that was there an hour ago. So this is, I think, the idea of critical anthropomorphism or anti-anthropocentrism, that we have to recognize what it's like a little bit to be these other species when we're studying them. And it's actually a fun exercise to do as well, right? When you're engaging with the animals you're trying to understand, like, what is it like to have a tail? What does this do to your experience of the environment to have this other appendage? So it requires some imagination. And then anthropectomy is this was introduced as a kind of flip side of anthropomorphism. So anthropomorphism, the idea again, is this attributing human characteristics to non-human animals, usually with the idea that it's done without reason. And anthropectomy means cutting out a human quality from an animal, usually with the understanding that it's done without reason. So the criticism of anthropectomy is this criticism that we're denying a property to a non-human animal just because it's a property that humans have. And again, we need to do the research before we know whether or not the property is had or not. But it was just naming a bias that Brian Huss and I took to be the flip side of the bias that we see in the worries about anthropomorphism. This is also something that Frans de Waal has written quite a bit about. He calls it anthropodenial, and we just coined a new term for the same idea. A lot of people have talked about this worry that we need to have we need to be able to recognize both kinds of errors if we're going to be discussing this on an even playing field. Because
All right.
really what we want to do in our science is to try to make accurate claims about the world. That's what we want to do.
Right. Yeah. And I think just it's surprising how putting a name to something can be so effective in flipping a switch and making people realize, oh yeah, that is a problem. Yeah. And I think I really like your discussion of anti-anthropomorphism or critical anthropomorphism as, anti-anthropocentrism or critical anthropomorphism. I'm in danger of doing a bit of a Joe Biden here. I'm in constant. These days, I'm constantly thinking, oh gosh, I just substitute one word for another. Does that, are my mental faculties failing me? But I think we've got to approach these things in the spirit of generosity. Anyway, that's a complete by the by. So
I call Descartes Darwin, so
oh yeah,
I think you're fine.
You're not going to be president of the US. Okay. Yeah, so I mean, I think that was a really good take on it, and that is, I think, the third piece of the third of the three rules, which is of those three rules, the one that you would agree is that we shouldn't, we do need to be anti-anthropocentric and try to imagine ourselves in the umwelt of other species, and I guess, I mean, being critical of the first two rules, embracing the third, is it? Let me put this another way: how much traction is this getting? Are kind of comparative psychologists receiving your ideas and actually saying, yes, this, pesky philosopher of science actually may be onto something? Is it informing the science? These kind of criticisms that you're bringing to the field?
Well, some of my colleagues say it is, but I think that I'm not in a position to really know to what extent this has been widespread in any kind of acceptance. I do think that there's a new generation of comparative cognition researchers who are more willing to investigate things like consciousness and more willing to do things like recognize you can have a relationship with your research subject, recognize that there are levels of explanation and that folk psychological explanations are not anti-scientific, but they're a way of organizing behaviors into patterns that can then be used when you're investigating mechanisms or physical implementations at a neurobiological level. So I think there is change, but we're still waiting. I'm still waiting, I should say, for the next generation of textbooks to come out.
Aha, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that will be really interesting to see. And I do have to say, I think this is such a fascinating example of a place where philosophy can speak directly to science. This is not metaphysics, right? It's philosophy of mind, but in a way that really connects with the research. And your papers are probably more scientific research than philosophical articles. If I haven't done a count, but I mean, just though, at least those are all the pieces that I remember are sort of drawing from scientific literature and saying, look, here are some experiments which seem very hard to deny that there is, something more than just behaviorism going on. There's, the best explanation of this is that there is something behind this, a mind behind this. So yeah, I do find it a really great example of where philosophers can productively enter the scientific discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I'm doing philosophy of mind as philosophy of science. And in order to do any philosophy of science, I think it's really important to actually know the science well. And so I had already said that I tell my students they have to go into the field or go into the lab. They have to be exposed to the science. But I also make them read the science. We have regular discussion groups with scientists. They get training in science as well as in philosophy. So it is quite robustly interdisciplinary research, which makes it a lot of fun, I think. And we've had a lot of great conversations over the years with the scientists, and in our Greater Toronto Area Animal Cognition Discussion Group. It's been very fun learning how to talk across disciplines because we have our own languages. It's hard sometimes to translate what we mean by terms, and consciousness is one of those terms that's really hard to let people know what you're talking about. But we've had a lot of very goodwill because we're all friends. And I think we've done a lot of really good work there and trained a nice generation of students in philosophy of animal minds.
Yeah. Let's talk about one of the. So I think these criticisms that you've made are, I hope, gaining traction, and we'll wait for the next crop of textbooks to see. I want to talk about one other very bold suggestion that you've made recently, which is that the null hypothesis in should be consciousness for other animals, and that's new because when people are in the business of looking for markers of consciousness in other animals at the moment, and there's kind of it seems to be there's a kind of industry or almost various subfields which are concerning themselves with looking for markers of consciousness in other animals. But you argue that it's almost inevitable that we find these. And one of the, actually, I mean, perhaps you can take us through the case of C. elegans, which I think, suggests just why we're so likely to find, consciousness might be so widely distributed in life. Or maybe not, but at least the things that we're doing to look for consciousness probably get positive answers all over the animal kingdom.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so right now we don't have a secure theory of consciousness, of course. There's a recent paper that came out that identified over 200 theories of consciousness that are on the table right now. And the one thing everyone agrees on is that none of these are secure. Some have better evidence, and some than others, but none are secure. So what do we do when we are interested in questions about who is conscious, like which other species are conscious? The kind of best practice that we have right now is to use this kind of marker methodology. And the marker methodology goes back to, right, these ancient philosophical questions about other minds. How do we know that anyone has a mind? And this goes for humans too, right? I don't see your mind directly. I see your behavior, I see your body, I see, the environment you're moving around in, but I don't see your conscious experience. I can experience my own conscious experience. I have direct awareness of it. That's how I know I have a mind, conscious mind. And the kind of general answer, John Stuart Mill gives this argument from analogy. Well, you're doing the same things that I'm doing when I have a mind, so I'm just inferring that you have a mind as well. And so that really gets to this idea that it's observable markers or indicators of consciousness that we are using in order to justify our commitment to minds in other humans and in other animals as well. And this is the marker methodology that is the best practice for trying to answer this question about non-human animals. It's used in animal welfare science, where they're really interested in trying to figure out how to make living conditions more humane for captive animals used in research or in agriculture. And it's also used when people are interested in just a general distribution question, like which animals are conscious? How do we figure that out? And so I think that we can identify different sets of markers to begin with. We have these kind of starting markers that make us think that something might be conscious because they're moving in ways that seem agential, that there's this kind of biological movement. So this is humans, but also pretty much any animal we see moves in ways that look goal directed, whether it's a bee that goes, flies from flower to flower and in a way that makes sense, or an ant that's carrying a little crumb on their back, going back into a hole with all the other ants, or your dog that's pawing at the back door when they want to go outside for a walk. Right? All of these are explainable and look agential. It's also when we see, the behaviors of animals that we know really well, like say your pet dog, that you have relationships with them. You feel like the dog's responding to your emotions. You can respond to the dog's emotions. Maybe you're making eye contact. Maybe you play, things like that. All of these are observable behaviors of the same sort that we have with other human minds that can be used to justify our commitment that they're conscious. But there are fewer of these kind of initial markers with some animals, right? Animals that we can't see close up, that behave in ways that are very different from us. And when we don't have relationships with them, like the ants and the bees, and sea sponge spores and scary looking things that live at the bottom of the ocean, these initial markers have less weight. And so we look for other sorts of markers as well. We can look for neurobiological markers. These help in cases also with humans when they're not engaging in the kind of typical behaviors. Say, consider a human with a disorder of consciousness who's like a non-responsive in a coma, and we want to know whether they have conscious experience or not. Science researchers are able to identify some neurobiological markers that provide evidence of conscious experience in some of these patients. We could use this with infants who don't yet talk or engage in a lot of really good goal-oriented behaviors because they don't have control of their body yet. Presumably, we could use this with fetuses as well. But we can use it with non-human animals who don't engage in the same sorts of primary behaviors that we're often recognizing in other mammals. And so in the case of, say, C. elegans, right, this is a microscopic worm. It has 304 to 20 neurons, depending on the stage of development they're in. And you might ask, are they conscious? Do they have these initial markers? Well, they have some of the initial markers. They have goal-directed behavior that we can observe through microscopes. We can see them move towards nutrient substances and moving away from substances that are aversive to them. But we can also use these kind of neurobiological markers in order to help bolster evidence that they're experiencing things as well. We can see that they've got a nerve ring. We can see that they integrate information from different sensory modalities. We can also look at behaviors that are a bit more complex and set up an experiment to test what they'll do in a certain condition. So, for example, one of the experimental paradigms that are used in order to provide evidence of pain experience in animals is called a motivational trade-off test. This sort of a test involves exposing an animal to kind of two bad options. All right, so in the case of a hermit crab, the two bad options are being shocked and leaving your nice shell. So they don't want to do either of those things. And so they have to weigh off which is worse. Bob Elwood and his colleagues have done a lot of work on this with the hermit crabs. And what they found is that in that case, the hermit crabs will tolerate a higher shock when they're in a higher quality shell before they leave it. But if they're in a lower quality shell, they'll leave it sooner with a lower range of a shock. So they seem to value these nicer shells more. They'll suffer more bad consequences before they suffer the consequence of leaving the good shell. In the case of C. elegans, something similar was done with them. And they presented the C. elegans with a nutritive substance that they wanted, but then they put an aversive chemical in front of the food item. And so they waited to see what the C. elegans would do. And hunger is one thing you want to avoid, and going through this yucky chemical is another thing you want to avoid. And what they saw is that it took the C. elegans time to get for their hunger level to go up before they would go through this aversive substance. And so this looks like it might be something similar to what was happening in the hermit crab case. So these are just very beginning pieces of evidence for C. elegans. As far as I know, none of the C. elegans researchers themselves have been studying consciousness or markers of pain in particular in C. elegans. I think that it's a really good opportunity to study pain experience in a very, very different system, to see what sort of other behavioral markers of pain experience we can find in the C. elegans, and then look and see what part of their nerve ring is involved in these sorts of pain behaviors, in order to try to get at the physical correlates, the neurobiological correlates of pain experience in the C. elegans, which might then help us understand pain experience in us and in other mammals with our much more convoluted brains, with our so many neurons and so many brain structures. Whenever we study a simpler model in science, we make progress. And in consciousness science, we've not been studying simpler models. I mean, the simpler model has been a macaque monkey. That's still not very simple. Um, and so I think if we switched, maybe not switched, but added to the research going on in consciousness science and started studying simpler models like C. elegans, which are readily available in labs at almost every university that's got a biochemistry lab, we might be able to make significant progress. Um, and yeah, it seems like we're like, 20 years later, and we still don't know what the neural correlates of consciousness are. We're still stuck with these 200 plus theories. But maybe it's because we've not been doing the right kind of science. So I'm super excited to propose this idea that we stop asking this question, oh, who's conscious? Which animals are conscious? And then instead say, okay, let's just assume that animals are conscious, and then examine different dimensions of consciousness, right? Self-awareness, pain experience, pleasure experience, and examine those very specific dimensions of consciousness in a variety of species, in order to try to figure out how these are implemented, what the mechanisms are in those species. That, I think, is going to give us real progress.
Right. So we move away from this distribution question to this question of dimension, and also at the same time, open ourselves up to looking at really perhaps edge cases of consciousness, which I think is always something fruitful for science. Like if you can find where, maybe it's not C. elegans, but maybe there's some slightly smaller brain where we just don't find any of the markers of consciousness, and then we can start to draw a line between what is required at the physical level
Absolutely.
before. Yeah. So I think this is really promising. And I have to ask, are there other? I know you're looking at animal societal norms, and I am curious: is there something analogous to be done here? At the moment, the question is perhaps do animals have societal norms? Should it just be assumed that all animals have societal norms? That maybe even all animals have culture? Perhaps that's too far of a null hypothesis, but are there any new null hypotheses you'd like to throw out?
Yeah, that's it's a super interesting question. On the question of animal culture, I think that we've kind of we might be in a similar situation now, because we've asked this question about chimpanzee cultures in 1999, 2000. This Nature paper came out finding cultural differences in different chimpanzee communities. And then 25 years later, what we found is culture in every species where it's been looked for, including fruit flies, right? Including bumblebees. So, and you might say, well, what do you mean by culture then? It's been found everywhere. What do you mean? You don't mean like museums and and works of art. So what the scientists are referring to by culture are group level traditions that are acquired through social learning. This is in contrast with having innate behaviors, right? So one of the postulates of human uniqueness that I often hear is that, oh, humans alone are able to learn things. Humans alone are able to solve problems in real time when they're confronted with them in their environment, and then they can learn them from other members of their community. That is not human unique. That is found in fruit flies. That is found in bumblebees. Social learning is widespread. So I think that asking like about shifting the null hypothesis for animal culture to all animals is we're probably in a very similar situation to the situation we are with the markers for consciousness, where I would predict we'd continue to find them as we look for them. This question of social norms is slightly different, I think, because we haven't yet really even started an empirical investigation of social norms in non-human animals. What we have is kind of the place, we're at the place where Darwin was in The Descent of Man. We have a lot of anecdotes. We have a lot of stories about animals who seem to be enforcing patterns of behavior that exist in their communities, enforcing these patterns either by letting young individuals watch them and learn them, or assisting them by some form of teaching, some evidence of punishment in a few rare cases. But we don't yet have a lot of empirical evidence. And I think that this is a point where we're at a point in the investigation where it would be most fruitful to just go out with this account of what a social norm is, that is a pattern of behavior that's maintained by community members, either through a positive or negative reinforcement, and find out where they might be and what they might be in different communities. Now, if you ask me to speculate how widespread they are, I think I'd be willing to predict that we're going to find them in lots of different animal societies as well. And I think that social norms probably are going to go along with any kind of group living animal that is conscious. And if we're predicting that all animals are conscious, or presuming that all animals are conscious, maybe we should presume that all animals have social norms too. I don't know if that's fruitful right now for the science. In the same way, people often ask me, should we presume that plants are conscious too? And my response is, I don't know if that's going to be fruitful for the science right now. That might be too far of an edge case for us to investigate. We don't maybe have the methods to do really good research in that area right now. So yeah, it might not be fruitful for the science to assume that all animals have social norms. But certainly we should look for social norms in any species that you're studying. I think that would be a really robust and vibrant science.
Again, I'm reminded of my conversation with Gordon Burkhardt and how, in coming up with a definition for play, he kind of made it somewhat acceptable to look for those activities in animals, where before people had been very, perhaps rather nervous about looking for calling something play in animals because it had been deemed too anthropomorphic. And again, perhaps we have these overhangs and this feeling that society is something uniquely human, but just unpacking the definition of social norm maybe just makes people a bit more open-minded to look for those kinds of behaviors, and then once we discover them in enough places, we can say, well, actually, yeah, clearly there are societies here.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Being clear on what we mean by the question when we ask, do animals have culture, has to be the first step. And that's what really allowed for a lot of progress in the science of animal culture, defining culture in terms of group level traditions that are socially learned. One of the kind of trends, I think, in a lot of comparative psychology is exactly as you identified in Gordon Burkhardt's account of play, is when we stop focusing on assumptions about what the cognitive mechanisms are and instead focus on the observable patterns of behavior and get really clear on those patterns of interest and define them, we make progress. Um, the next step, once we've identified patterns of behavior, is to figure out how the animals are doing it. What are the mechanisms? What do you need to have? What kind of neurobiological machinery do you need to have? What sort of cognitive processes do you need to have in order to do these things? And that's a further question. The first step really is identifying these patterns of interest and defining them really clearly. And so that's what was done with play, what was done with culture, what was done with teaching, and now what we've done with social norms. And since this paper came out, that we had, I can't tell you, 10 authors on a paper on how to study animal norms in non-human great apes, non-human primates, actually. We found a lot of interest among scientists in taking up this question. There's been a lot of enthusiasm in the conferences we've gone to, the conversations we've had with scientists. And our next step is to just get the funding and do the research. And once we do that with great apes, I think, is the first step, we'll probably move on and explore it in other species. This is exactly how things worked in culture. I started with great apes, kind of easiest test case because we've studied them quite extensively on this kind of societal level. But I think we might find them in a wide variety of animal species. And it's so exciting to be at this kind of edge of knowledge too. I think that we're going to be learning more and more and should expect more of these kind of exciting discoveries as time goes on. And I think that once we make these exciting discoveries, it really does, well, for me at least, it causes me to see humans differently, right? It causes me to see us as just another, culture of another species that also engages with other cultures and other species, and that we are more socially interconnected as well. And so right now I've got fruit flies in my kitchen. It's July, so I don't know about you, but I've got, a lot of fruits in my kitchen, and sometimes they sit on the counter and sometimes they get overripe, and the fruit flies love them. And what I used to do is I'd make little fruit fly traps with some vinegar and soapy water and saran wrap with little holes in them and trap and drown the fruit flies. But ever since I found out that fruit flies have culture and that female fruit flies learn who to mate with by watching other female fruit flies have sex. So, I mean, that's so weird and cool and awesome. And since I learned that, and like I look at the fruit flies on my berries in a different way. And instead of making the traps, I just like take the bowl of berries outside and then brush them away and then bring the berries back and put them in the fridge or cover them with saran wrap. Like I don't feel comfortable drowning the fruit flies if I don't have to. So I'm living with them, right? We're living with these other species. I am not, the only important person in the world in my house. It's the fruit flies that live there, the ants that live there, and the spiders that live there are important too. If the rats who live outside get in my house, I'm definitely getting them outside of my house one way or another. If I have to kill them, so be it. But I'd prefer not to if I don't have to. It just gives me a little bit more appreciation for all of the animals that we live with. Doing this kind of research, and it's a nice way of seeing the world. It's a very friendly way. You don't feel lonely when your house is also filled with fruit flies who are learning who to have sex with by watching other fruit flies mate. That's just awesome.
I think I have so many more questions that I would love to ask, but I also feel like that was just a lovely point that you made, and I can't think of a better way to end it. Right? If we can find such an appreciation for the humblest of creatures, in a way that enriches our own lives, right? It's not pure charity, like to keep these through private lives. They are just wonderfully fascinating things, and they have value in their own right. So yeah. Unless you have, I don't know if you want to add any other things, perhaps some information on. I know you've got a book coming out, so in case people are listening to this in the future, well, that's almost certainly the case. But yeah, if you want to give some notes on that. But this has been such a wonderful conversation, Kristin. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, James. It was great talking to you. It was a lot of fun, and yeah, folks can check out my website, which I guess you'll link to if they're interested in reading any of my work.
Yes, I will do. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much.